Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. I'm Gene Paranak. It's so good to have you here today. Let's get today's agenda up. Today, episode 82, amazing, Friday, November 5th of 2021. First of all, the COVID news, but with a twist today. We'll get there in just a second. After that, part 2 of our series, How Do I Get a 510K? You know, for all the things we've talked about on this show, all the guests we've had, we were taken aback by one very simple question we received, which is, I just need an overview of how I get a 510K. So we're dedicating this month of November to answering that question in great detail. And today is week 2 of that. After that, Q&A time and announcements from the community. If you have something that's happening, you are welcome to announce it at the end of the show. That'll be to our live audience as well as to anyone who hears the recording afterwards. So we welcome you to think about that and join us with any announcements you may have. Well, let's go to the COVID news. And you're going to see this slide already looks different. COVID metrics and vaccine distribution. If you recall, way back in the day, CDC finally stepped up to the plate and was gathering data in a coherent way. And in fact, they started launching these very detailed, roughly 20-page PDFs every week for each state. It was wonderful, and if you recall, for the last number of months, that's what we've been reporting on for our source of truth for the data around COVID, interspersed with articles from folks like Nature and Lancet and other things like that. Well, it turns out that when we went to look this week for CDC data, they had wiped those reports. They're not doing them anymore. Sure, you can get other data from CDC. It's not like they wiped all their data, but some of those wonderful graphical summaries that they've been putting together just went away. So we don't quite know what that means. As we started to try to put together some of the same graphics we've been showing you over the last months, we were able to pull a few of them out of the other CDC data through a lot of effort. Here's the level of community transmission in the US. Good news there in the South, continuing to lighten up. That's really wonderful because I tell you 4 weeks ago, this was just all red everywhere. And you can see that the numbers for high transmission are dropping while the numbers for moderate transmission are rising. So generally good news. We were also sort of able to reconstruct this picture, new admissions of COVID-19 per 100 staffed beds, all counties in the US. Still some higher numbers out in the Rocky Mountain area, but seems to be dropping everywhere else, which is wonderful, wonderful news. This leaves us asking, where is our source of truth for COVID data? And for the moment, and this may change in the coming weeks, we're going to be bringing you data from covidactnow.org, which sources their data through the New York Times. And so as we sort of ask this question of where do we get these nice graphical summaries anymore, this is what we'll be leaning to, at least for the moment. Here's a graph of cases in the state of Michigan over the course of the pandemic. You can see the 45.8 cases per 100,000 people. Still not at the levels in the last 2 waves of the pandemic, but certainly crawling up there. Now, keep in mind that cases are a function of testing. So in counties that test a lot or where a lot of testing is mandated, you're going to catch more of the cases that are truly there. In counties where you're not testing a lot, you're not going to catch a lot of the cases that are truly there. So you have to take this number with a grain of salt. What's perhaps more interesting is the positive test rate in Michigan throughout the entirety of the pandemic, ignoring some of those early outlying data points. You can see that the positivity rate has been up as high as approximately 15% through the last 2 waves. This wave, it's coming up right around to 10%. That means about 10% of the tests that are done come back positive. Here's the data for hospitalizations. Not as high, thankfully, as the last 2 waves, but a little bit over 2,000 COVID hospitalizations at the moment. How does that affect ICU capacity? Again, over the course of the pandemic, since data was being collected on it, ICU capacity in the state of Michigan hovering up and down around 75, 80%. So that's how those numbers have changed. Actually, an interesting graph and one that we haven't showed before through the CDC data. Deaths do continue to climb. We saw them climbing up slowly, certainly not at the rates before, and hasn't reached the height of either of these three waves, but still up there at around 50 daily deaths in the state of Michigan, a state with approximately 10 million folks in the state. In terms of vaccinations, again, the state of Michigan data up at 58% with one dose, 54% fully vaccinated. So continuing to climb, but slowly since, since April of, or May of this year. That's the COVID news. We promised to find a better data source here and to start bringing that to you. Of course, disappointing. CDC a couple of years ago wasn't doing such a great job. Now suddenly they've just dropped these really useful and understandable graphics that I know many of us have enjoyed. So we'll continue to find better sources for that, but not the news that we all wanted to hear. Well, in local news, much better news, A2 Biosocial is back this Tuesday, November 9th at York in Ann Arbor, 4:30 to 6:30 p.m., sponsored by MIHQ. Come on out and see some real live people, food and drinks outdoors. Hope to see you there. And the $2,500 quarterly pitch party. We're having the pitch party again. We're still soliciting companies for that. Remember, it's a pitch party. It's not a pitch competition. Our goal is to have our judges reflect on what they liked, what they didn't like. Not to pick winners and losers. We can't do that. But we do enjoy talking about good pitches and finding out what our judges like and what they don't like. Send those pitch decks to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org and make sure they have the areas of problem statement, vision, value proposition, team, milestones, business model, and your competitors, as well as your ask. We want to hear about all of those so that we can reflect on them with you and let our judges at the end tip their hat towards one of them for a $2,500 prize. Our judges are Andy Rader of Evergreen M&A Partners, Dr. Nikki Kennedy, a vascular surgeon and the founder of Arbor Hive, Jim Metzger, the president of Keystone Solutions Group, and Stacy Frankovich, the program manager from MedHealth. We're looking forward to having them back for the next installment of the pitch party. I saw a LinkedIn post that our friends over at Keystone had a chili cook-off the other day on the west side of the state, the very same day that our team enjoyed chili together. So it must be that time. And if you've got your chili anecdotes for your team for this year, we'd love to hear them at the end of the show. Is everybody eating chili? And did everyone eat chili this week? Seems like an important fall tradition that's coming back. So with that, let's go to our main event today. It's a 4-part series. How do I get a 510K? It's a simple question with a much more complicated answer. And while we've talked about many elements that go into the development of MedTech over the course of now 82 episodes, what's not been answered in a linear, very straightforward fashion is this very simple question that so many startups have. How do I get a 510K? Yeah, I know there's all these things that I have to do as a MedTech company, but how do I do that in a way that gets me to that end goal? So we've broken this up into 4 parts. Last week, we presented on how do I know if a 510K is right for me? We'll refresh you just a little bit on that before we continue forward. Today, we're talking about what goes into a 510K from a statutory standpoint, from a requirements standpoint from the FDA. Then on Friday, November 12th, we'll talk in more practical terms of how do I prepare for a 510K? What does my team have to do? And then on Friday, November 19th, what happens after I file? Well, as you can imagine, it's not always just a straight walk to the end goal. So we'll talk about what happens after a filing goes into the FDA. Just a reminder, A 510K, also known as a pre-market notification, well, first of all, it's a pre-market submission. This means you have to do it before you go to market, and it means you have to submit it to the FDA. The goal of it is to demonstrate that your device that you're selling, now remember, devices can include things like assays as well as hard devices. They can include things like software as well as what you would think of as a device. But you have to demonstrate that the device is as safe and effective, that is, substantially equivalent to a legally marketed predicate device. The basis of this type of clearance is not, I'm safe and effective. The basis of this type of clearance is that you are as safe and effective as a device that's already allowed on the market. That becomes really important when we start to talk about what goes into a 510K. So last time, we answered the question, what is a 510K? We talked about when is a 510K required, when is it not required. We discussed the need for product classification to define a regulatory roadmap. If you were here last week, you know that we're not very fond of static regulatory roadmaps, because as the description of your device changes, as the intended use of your device changes during early development, your pathway is going to change. You have to be cognizant of what levers are going to change those requirements. Then we gave an intro to predicates and substantial equivalence, which we'll go into a little more depth on today. But if you want to see last week's session, you can go to YouTube. You can get there by searching Into Being, by searching MedTech Crossroads. You can go through our website, intobeing.com, on the Webinars tab under MedTech Crossroads. And I hope you watch it, hope you enjoy it. To remind you from last week, when a 510K is required, we said that FDA defines this as each person who wants to market in the US a class 1, 2, or 3 device intended for human use basically has to submit a 510K. Well, it's not quite true. There's 2 exceptions. One is if your device is exempt from 510K. Most class 1 devices, for example, are exempt from 510K. Or if you're required to submit a PMA or a pre-market approval. In those 2 cases, you're not going through the 510K pathway. Or if you're a de novo product, you might be going not through the 510K pathway. But for all others, and it's roughly half of the devices in the US, the 510K pathway is the way to market. So today, we're going to be talking about what goes into a 510K. It's a whole smorgasbord of things. We're going to talk about why is this thing even called a 510K? That takes us into the world of regulations, the regulation number jumble, as we like to call it. Then we're going to give you a sense of where this is all going. I know I've got to prepare this thing, and I know there's stuff that's got to go into it, but what's the end goal, and what happens when this thing finally goes to FDA? We'll back up from there to user fees, things like small business determinations. Then we'll talk about a checklist that's really, really useful with an ominous sounding name, the refuse to accept checklist. We'll talk about what you need before you start, and then what goes into a 510K specifically. So with that, this is kind of the laundry list episode. We're going to go deep into the regulations. It's kind of the kitchen sink episode. We're going to throw everything in there. So to make this a little bit more fun, we're also going to throw a challenge out there. For all of you who are listening live, if you're listening to this on recording, I'm sorry, it's too late. But for all who are listening live today, we're going to throw a $25 gift card into this for the person who can send us an email. That email goes to info@intobeing.com. That's info at intobeing, IN2BEING.com, who can tell us during the section where we are quoting for a specific real product, the 510K summary, if you can tell us what clinical data was offered to the FDA, again, what clinical data was offered to the FDA the first person to send an email to info@intobeing.com, we're going to have some fun. We're going to send you a $25 gift card. And keep your ears peeled for that. What clinical data was offered to FDA as a part of the 510K, the real 510K, which we'll be making a summary of later in this show. So hopefully that perks your ears and gives you something to listen for as we go forward. Well, first of all, why 510K? Why is this even called a 510K? It goes back to something called the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. This is what gave FDA authority to regulate things in this way. It's a pretty simple section, and wouldn't you know, it's section 510, subsection K, which says that each person who's required to register and who proposes to begin the introduction or delivery into interstate commerce for commercial distribution of a device intended for human use, at least 90 days before, they have to report the following to the secretary: the class in which the device is classified, which is under section 513, and the action taken to comply with requirements under section 514, which are performance standards, or 515, which is pre-market approval. That's the basis of this entire pre-market notification process that we're also familiar with as a 510K. Now, of course, this was the act that got the ball rolling. That act had to be put into regulations that could be followed and enforced. So the act got ensconced into 21 CFR 807. Here comes the number jumble. And under 807, you have these different subparts. One part has to do with establishment registration, an important thing to be registered with the agency. But down under subpart E of section 807 are the pre-market notification procedures. Let's zoom into that for just a second. There's a whole lot of things in here, but today we're really going to focus on this section, information that's required in a pre-market notification submission, the format of such a submission, the content and the format of a 510K summary. That's where you're going to want to be listening, because as we said just a few moments ago, for those of you who are just joining us, that anyone who's listening live and can identify what clinical data was offered during that 510K summary statement that we will be discussing later from a real company for a real application. If you can tell us what clinical data was offered to the FDA as a part of that application, the first person to do that will be getting a $25 gift card. So before we talk about what goes into a 510K submission, let's go all the way to the end of this process. That wonderful day is going to come where you put this application in the mail or send the FDA an e-copy. When that happens, this is where it's going. There's a process that FDA is going to follow when they open that up. The first part of that is an acceptance review. There's what's called a refuse to accept checklist. Now, it's kind of an ominous sounding name, but what it really is a pre-screen to see if you've even got the right sections for the things that FDA is looking for. I don't really want to go digging through your hundreds or thousands of pages in detail if they're not pretty well convinced you put most of the right areas in there, let alone the right details. If they put you on a hold, you have up to 180 days to respond to that hold with the additional information needed. Now, the good news is, as we'll talk about in just a minute, that checklist is available. There's no reason for you to send out the door a 510K that doesn't have all the correct elements. Whether they all say the right things and convince the FDA of your case, that's another matter. But a failure to include the things that are on that checklist would be a pretty large one indeed. Then comes the substantive review by the agency. They have to start executing this within 60 calendar days of receipt of your 510K. They may request an interactive review. That's usually a good thing because the reviewer is going to be talking back and forth with you kind of on a live basis, interacting and trying to get the information they need to get you to clearance. Or they may send an additional information request. It's a letter that says, hey, we can't determine substantial equivalence for this device. We need the following information. Once again, you have 180 days to respond to this with the requested additional information. Well, this should tell you right off the bat that even though FDA takes 90 days to get to a substantial equivalence or not substantially equivalent decision, those days are not calendar days. If you start to add this up, FDA has 60 days of that 90-day clock to even respond to you. Before that, they could have put you on a half a year hold. So we've got a half a year if for some reason you didn't get your RTA right. That's rare. But then in the substantive review, up to another 6 months to respond to deficiencies found in the first 60 days. So all told, this process can, if there's testing required by the company, can easily stretch out well over the half-year mark, even though it's thought of as a 90-day process. Here's what that looks like from FDA's perspective. Day 1, FDA receives the 510K submission. By day 7, they have to either acknowledge it or send a hold letter. By day 15, they conduct an acceptance review. And the question there is, do we go to substantive review or do we have to go on an RTA hold? Usually the answer is we're going right on to substantive review. By day 60, the FDA has to conduct that substantive review and respond to you either with a decision of substantial equivalence or with an interactive review or with additional information required. Now by day 90, they send their final MDUFA decision, Medical Device User Fee Act decision, on your 510K. If for some reason they fail to do that, by day 100, they have to report that. But in between day 60 and day 90 is where so much happens and where the FDA inevitably comes back with questions for you. And that's where often, at minimum, explanation is necessary. Sometimes having your clinical staff get out there and explain to FDA why you said what you said. Other times, testing is necessary. And sometimes it's testing you haven't done yet. So it's always good to anticipate when FDA might ask for things and get those going while you're waiting for their first response. Hey, wait, that's not the right picture. This shouldn't be a picture of money going under the table. Who threw that in there? Well, the good news is FDA doesn't hide the user fees that are charged for these types of activities. The annual establishment registration fee this year is up almost to $6,000, $5,672 for every establishment that needs to register with the agency. It's nearly $6,000. The application type has a fee associated with it, and you'll notice a big difference between the standard fee and the small business fee. We'll talk about that in just a second. The 510K has a nearly $13,000 user fee associated with it that the FDA is allowed to charge you. But if you're designated as a small business, that fee drops to only about $3,000. Certainly in your best interests to get designated as a small business. We'll talk about how to do that in just a second. Other things you've heard us mention on the show at other times, the 513G request for classification drops to $2,500 if you're a small business. Your PMA drops to the lowly number of $93,000, $94,000 if you're a small business. Otherwise, it's a whopping $375,000. De novo classification requests aren't cheap either. $112,000 for a small business, it's $28,000. And the list goes on for other user fees that the agency is authorized to charge. So if you're looking at this and you're saying, this is in my best interest to get designated as a small business, you would be absolutely correct. Here's what the small business determination is. A small business is defined as a business, including its affiliates, whose gross receipts and sales are less than 100 million for the most recent tax year. Most of our MedTech startups will fall under that number. It's an October 1st through September 30th year, and that makes for a little tricky maneuvering here. You really want to submit, if you can, between August 1st and September 30th for your small business designation and for your registration with FDA when that time comes. Because otherwise you're losing a part of the year for that registration. The small business designation has to be renewed each year, and you have to submit a prior year tax return, even if it's $0. This sometimes catches startups off guard who haven't filed a tax return to show a $0 income. And so make sure that you are doing that if you want to be interacting with the FDA. Well, we mentioned the refuse to accept checklist. There's a guidance for it, and it has the checklist embedded within it. In fact, there's 3 checklists. One is for a traditional 510K, one is for an abbreviated 510K, and one is for a special 510K, which we discussed those 3 last week. We'll focus on the traditional 510K just a little bit, and there's 34 substantial pages of checklist to be gone through. But the good news is it walks you through questions that you really should have thought about if you're going to be submitting a 510K. For example, here's the very first question. Is the product a device? You remember we started our discussion last week with that question. Is my product even a medical device? If it's not subject to 510K. And the FDA starts with that very same question. Here's another question from the checklist. Is the submission for a combination product that contains partly a drug? Well, if it is, then this isn't just a simple device 510K, and it needs to be thought about differently. We're applying to the wrong division in the wrong way. How about these organizational elements? Now, these strictly won't result in a refuse to accept, but you're not going to get your 510K until these are cleaned up. Do you have a table of contents? Is each section labeled? Are all the pages numbered? Yes, there's specific page numbering requirements. Is the type of 510K identified? If these things aren't there, and we'll tell you why in just a second, this is pretty serious to the FDA. Here's one more. The submission includes descriptive information for the device. And they break down in some detail the different sections they expect you to have in the description for the device in the 510K submission. So this refuse to accept checklist, very important things like labeling with nuance as to what you need to be showing for the labeling. Well, which brings us to this question, finally, what goes into a 510K? So now we've gotten to that point. Oh wait, no we didn't. Trick time in the presentation. One more thing. But this is from FDA, not from us. Important note, says the FDA. In order to address the required elements, you will need the following information to assure that your 510K is complete. If you do not have this information, you should obtain it prior to proceeding. What's that information that the FDA says is so important that you should really have it before you even try to file a 510K? Classification of your device. The predicate devices to which you're going to be claiming substantial equivalence. Final draft labeling for your device. Specifications including engineering drawings, photos, etc. Performance data, bench, animal, clinical testing if it's needed. Sterilization information if it's needed. Guidance documents if they exist for your device type. And even with that list, a lot of companies think, oh, I'll just get those things and put them down. Well, that's not quite the point. The reason that FDA says that these are critical things to have before you ever consider filing a 510K is because these three actually determine your development, testing, and clearance pathway. If you think you've done your device development, but you don't know the classification of your device, you don't know your predicate device, you don't know the guidance documents that are applicable to it, you actually haven't developed your device. You have to go back to some level and not start over from scratch, but you have to incorporate these elements into the design of your device. Or maybe you think you've got a device that's kind of working and you like it and you want to get it cleared with the agency. Well, these other elements cannot be offered to the agency until you have a relatively mature design history file, that you've been through design controls, and they are in a position to offer these responsive to the requirements that you've established for your device. You can't really create draft labeling until you have a device that you really understand and are ready to create labeling for. And the list goes on. So I don't want you to underestimate this page. In fact, this may be the most important page in today's presentation. Folks will go to FDA and they will say, hey, I want a 510K. But FDA lays out very clearly not only the elements of a 510K, which we're about to talk about, but the elements that you need to even be able to hope to write a 510K. And these interplay together in ways that the FDA doesn't really unpack, but that the experience that we've had, you definitely need to be able to generate the information to write that 510K in the future. Well, speaking of guidance documents mentioned at the end, this is an important one, but there are many others. The 510K program, evaluating substantial equivalence in pre-market notifications, guidance for industry and Food and Drug Administration staff. So this is an important guidance. There are others as well. But now we get to the real meat of this. What is it that goes into a 510K submission to FDA? Well, the first sections are fees and introductions. Not surprisingly, FDA wants to get their money. The medical device user fee cover sheet, which we will not elaborate on today, is the very first part that links up between your online user fee account and the 510K that you're submitting. After that, there's actually an optional CDRH, that's Center for Devices and Radiological Health, pre-market review submission cover sheet. There's a cover sheet that goes in. But you also have the option to include all those elements in what's called a cover letter. The date, the identification of the 510K, your contact info, registration number of your company, the common and trade names of your product, the classification of your product, the reason that you're submitting the 510K. These are the sorts of things that go into a cover letter, and it's not a lot different than you would expect. It's a pretty simple document. Also in that cover letter, define the predicate device that you're comparing for substantial equivalence, as well as the manufacturing sites that your company may be using, as well as any special controls that are being followed during the development of the device. Well, here's a picture of a library. Why do we put that up there? Well, because what you're writing is not a simple document. The document that is being created, or usually a package of documents, is like a massive library. It usually runs in the hundreds to thousands of pages. Well, how is a review agency supposed to review something that's thousands of pages long in any kind of reasonable time? If you understand that you are creating not just a simple document, but basically a library, you're going to be motivated to create the next required element, which is a table of contents. You're not just doing this because FDA asked you to. You're doing it because you want your argument to the agency to be heard and understood. You want them to be able to find the things that they're looking for, because believe me, just putting it somewhere in 1,000 pages doesn't mean that they will find it. They're not motivated to dig to every last page to look for something unless they can find it easily. So the table of contents has to make this document referenceable. Specific page numbering is required, like we mentioned earlier. and things have to be obviously findable, sometimes to a level that may surprise you. You say to yourself, and your team looks at each other and says, "We put that in there." Yeah, you did. But if you can't find it easily, FDA is going to come back and say, "We didn't see this in your document." Look, if you think this is boring, your reviewers are going to also. So make sure you make it easy for them. Make sure that they can find things. In fact, here's one way to look at it. Your cover letter just provides an intro. But if you can't find the kinds of things referenced in the cover letter that you know should be in there, you might not even look then at the next level down, the table of contents, for some of those pointers. And if you can't find a solid idea that you're going to find what you're looking for there, you're never going to dive into the discussion sections to find those details. And if a discussion and an argument section of the 510K doesn't contain a pretty obvious reference to some part that you think is an important part of your argument, no one's ever going to dive into the test reports to find the minutia where those results actually exist. So if you create a hierarchy that gets those high-level points out there right from the get-go, then your reviewers will have more of a chance of finding what they're looking for. And really, that's what you're looking for, because without those arguments being made and made well, they're never going to find it. They're never going to clear you. Well, the next element is the 510K acceptance checklist, which we talked about earlier. This is your opportunity to include that. So we won't belabor that section of the submission. Next up is a statement of indications for use. We talked last week about how intended use and indications for use are subsets. One is a subset of the other. And that needs to be included in a straightforward way in your submission as a standalone section. The next part is the 510K summary or statement. And I want to spend just a little bit of time on this, because this is one, instead of giving you a whole bunch of legalese, I want to take you through an actual 510K summary. Get this part of your 510K, the FDA is going to cut out, and they're going to put on the internet 30 days following your SE decision, your substantial equivalent decision. This means you have to view this part of your submission as something that's going to be publicly viewable. The rest of your submission won't be publicly viewable, but this part will be. Nevertheless, it has to contain certain elements. Here's one that was published by Smith's Medical. We just came across this one. Nothing is implied by the selection of this particular one, except that it's a particularly good example of having all the right sections of a 510K summary. The first part is it has the words 510K summary, which is a part that FDA actually requires. After that, it has the owner contact info for the submission, the date prepared, and it contains the trade, common, and classification names of the device. Now, I will say that it being November, the name Snuggle Warm Blanket sure did seem appealing. It also contains a section on predicate devices. What is the predicate to which you are claiming substantial equivalence? And they do a good job of describing that predicate device. Next up, the device description. The device description goes into what the device does and technologically how it works. FDA talks about this as being a common trade description of the device. Next up, the section indications for use or intended use. In this case, they very clearly state this device is for thermal regulation of a patient's temperature to prevent hypothermia and or reduce cold discomfort during and after surgical procedures. It's intended for use by appropriately trained healthcare professionals in clinical environments. So this one, very nice, clear indications for use statement. FDA also says you have to discuss the technological characteristics of your device. Now, why would this matter specifically? Well, if you recall from last week, substantial equivalence is based on the same intended use and the same technological characteristics, or the same intended use where the differing technological characteristics don't raise new questions of safety or effectiveness. So why does this feature prominently on the 510K summary? Because you have to describe whether those technological characteristics are there, and if they're there, why they don't change the safety and effectiveness. Non-clinical data. FDA says you have to describe any non-clinical data collected. Now, different companies will describe this in the 510K summary in more or less detail. Of course, in the 510K itself, you're going into great detail with test reports up the wazoo. But in the 510K summary, it's often just a simple statement like this, where you have the standards that have been followed listed, and it's pretty much left at that. So non-clinical data, an important part. Some of you are going to be interested in this, clinical data. They have the section, but they very clearly say not required. And in this case, FDA has actually said, tell us about the clinical data if it's required. But this is a very good technique to still put the section in and to say none was required, end of story, we're not justifying it, there you go. And the conclusion section. This is often overlooked in device filings with regulatory bodies. To come to a conclusion at the end. I designed this great device for this wonderful intended use. I created it. I made tests for it. I passed those tests. And then it's left hanging. Okay, what do you conclude about this package that you're submitting to us, says the FDA? Well, here Smiths did a nice job of saying the proposed device is safe and effective and is substantially equivalent to the predicate device. What you see in a microcosm in this 510K summary is in fact the type of argument that has to be created in the 510K itself. You have to not just show the design, not just show the substantial equivalence, but you have to conclude that the device is substantially equivalent for the reasons that you have presented beforehand. So don't miss that very, very important point. So clinical data is a section that's required in the 510K summary. The conclusion is a section that's required in the 510K summary. Hopefully the emails are coming in because many of you are going to be very interested in that slide. The next section, the truthful and accurate statement. This is simply a statement saying that everything contained inside the 510K is truthful and accurate. This would strike many as being going without saying, but nevertheless, the FDA does deem it necessary to have you go on record as saying that everything you've said is true and accurate. And now this, another very important section in the 510K. Proposed label ing. Why do we underline the ing? Now, first of all, whatever this word means, you really only need your final draft of it. You don't have to have the final glossy, beautiful labels. Because if the FDA comes back and says, we need you to change your labeling, you really don't want to have created those yet. So all you have to go with in the 510K itself, even though the product has to be final, is the final draft of the labeling. But why labeling? Why not label? Or aren't those synonymous? Well, Section 201K defines the word label as a display of written, printed, or graphic matter upon the immediate container of any article. That makes sense. That's the label of the package. But labeling means something just a little bit different. Section 201M defines labeling as all labels and other written, printed, or graphic matter upon any article or any of its containers or wrappers or accompanying such article at any time while a device is held for sale after shipment or delivery for shipment in interstate commerce. What does that all mean? Well, it went to an appellate court, and what they concluded was most, if not all, advertising is labeling. In fact, it goes further. Sales agent statements can be understood as labeling. If you are offering a device for sale for a purpose other than that which it was intended for, or if warnings are missing where they should be, then you have mislabeled that device. It may be adulterated, it may be misbranded, or other things. So keep in mind that your labeling isn't just the label. It includes things like your website. In fact, there's many places. There you go. There's a bunch of labels. Remember the stars from kindergarten? It's not just the sticker. It's the other things like your website. Where do labeling requirements come from? Well, in fact, they come from all over the place. CFR Part 21 CFR Part 801, Part 809, Part 812, 830, 820, and Part 1010. So there's a number of places where labeling requirements have to be evaluated, have to be incorporated. Don't miss them. It's more important than you think it is. And labeling is often the very last thing that's getting thought of, and one of the things that lingers in your 510K prosecution, because FDA often will throw extra stuff in on your labeling when they kind of agree but kind of disagree. There's a section required in the 510K for specifications, and that has to be both a narrative description of the device and physical or technical description. How does this thing work? Indications for use, principle of operation, what kind of power does it use? What other information is necessary to understand the device? How will it be used with other devices? List all the variations of the new device you intend to market. That's the narrative part of the description. But the physical description could have diagrams, photographs, pictures, engineering drawings, all the things that really describe in technical detail what it is. Now, why would you want these things here? These folks who are reviewing your 510K, they've never seen your device before. And an intended use alone will not describe to them what they're up against. They need to get an understanding for how this device will be used so that they can think about the risks, about substantial equivalence, and whether they agree with your arguments or not. So a clear, concise description of your device will go a long ways to helping them understand. It is your job to help them understand. Otherwise, you're stuck with whatever is in their heads, and that's not always what you want it to be. Device-specific guidance documents, if available, are usually useful to help you understand how much information is necessary. The next section that's required is the one that the 510K is based around, and that is substantial equivalence. Remember we said before that substantial equivalence isn't identical equivalence, it's substantially equivalent. And it goes to things like intended use. Is this being used for the same intended use? To indications for use. Are the times when we would use it and the situation in which we would use it the same? What about the target population? Perhaps one is pediatric, perhaps one is geriatric, but nevertheless, what are the target populations? It's easy enough to say we're using our device for a subset of the population that the predicate device was used for. But what if you say we're using our device for a population that's not at all the same, not a subset, maybe a superset of what the predicate device is used for? Well, that becomes much harder to prove substantial equivalence to. Are you using it on the same anatomical site? Are you using it in a hospital, a home, an ambulance? And how does that compare to your predicate device? What kind of energy are you using or delivering? Is it the same? What about human factors? Where does it happen in the use workflow? How is it held? If these are substantially equivalent, you should be in good shape. But if they're different, you can trust that there are going to be questions from the agency. What about the design? Is it designed similarly? And the performance, does it behave similarly? What about the standards that are used? If you have a device that's very similar to your predicate device, but you didn't follow any of the same standards, you can believe that the FDA would have some questions, especially if the standards are relatively ubiquitous. What about materials? Well, if it doesn't have the same materials, there may be questions of durability, of biocompatibility, of sterility, and other things like that. Biocompatibility itself, compatibility with the environment and other devices. These are all things that you have to consider not just on their own, but with respect to substantial equivalence with your predicate device. If you're getting the idea at this point that you need to really be aware of your predicate device, understanding what its capabilities and limitations are, and being ready to compare against it in technical detail, then you're getting the right idea. Many teams will come and they will say, our device is safe and effective. Well, that's great, and we could probably prove that from scratch, but that's not what a 510K is there for. A 510K is to compare against another device. So you've got to understand that device. Things like sterility, things like electrical safety, mechanical safety, all these are elements that come into a comparison of substantial equivalence, as well as chemical safety, thermal safety, the list goes on. Finally, performance. And this may be one of the largest sections of your 510K, but it's relatively short to describe. Because the reality is most 510Ks will include some type of performance data. The extent of that data really depends on the complexity of your device and its intended use and indications. So you're going to have to do a comparison, and if your predicate device's performance is very complex and detailed, be ready to compare in detail against that predicate device. If it's not, you may get away with a smaller performance section. But what goes into that performance section? The actual results from engineering, bench testing, design verification, human factors, and animal testing, clinical studies if applicable, and clinical trials if applicable. So performance is something that we'll unpack more in coming weeks as we talk about how you actually put a submission like this together and what you're thinking about while you do it. But these are the elements that you have to have up front, you have to be ready to address. We'll be talking more about the details of how you address them in the coming weeks. If there's one slide I want you to take away though today, it's this one. In order to address the required elements, says FDA, as we read a few minutes ago, you'll need the following information. And if we look at how our industry behaves, many times the industry will silo inventors and engineers away from regulatory companies. And the regulatory company will say, if you just give us all the right things, we'll file your 510K. Well, today we've just told you what those things are. But if you're paying attention, you realize it's not as simple as just stuffing everything into a document and sending it off. It has to have a coherency to it. It has to be findable. And it has to make an argument that the FDA is going to accept for substantial equivalence of your device. As a development company, as an ideation company, as a clinical company, you will not get to that point unless you understand what's on this slide and can walk it as an expert. You have to understand how classification and predicate and guidance documents and standards drive your pathway. They have to be inputs to your device design. After that, you have to actually get to a point where you've created a coherent design history file. Because if you haven't, you won't be able to draw from it to make the arguments to the agency as a part of the sections that we've outlined today. I can't overstress how important it is to understand how these things relate to each other, because one is linked to the next, is linked to the next, will get you to that 510K. There's actually a lot of 510Ks that the FDA clears. In 2021, the FDA has been clearing somewhere between 200 and 300 510Ks per month. That's not an outsized number. That seems to be a typical number for the last couple of years. That doesn't mean it's an easy process. It just means there are a lot of people doing it, and for a relatively small staff, FDA is forced to look at thousands and thousands of pages of documents. If there's one thing you take away today, be ready to create this thing that is then readable. It actually has to be findable so that when your review staff says, we didn't see that in there, they just didn't look at your index. They didn't look at something very, very simple. And in worst case, it's easy for you to write back and say, oh, you forgot to look in this section. Go have a look, you'll find what you're looking for. That's the job of those who are creating your 510K for you. Next week, we'll be talking about how do I actually prepare a 510K. We'll get into some more of the fun details, because it's really the intersection, not just of these boring regulations by themselves, but the intersection of the regulations with what does walking that walk actually look like inside of the development process. So thanks for making it through today, the number jumble, the kitchen sink, the laundry lists, because they're setting the stage for what we're going to talk about next week, which is how do you actually do this? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it taste like inside of a development company as you're making this happen? So with that, we'll stop the share here. We'll open it up for any questions you may have. Look at that. We are a minute and 20 seconds away from the top of the hour. Feel free to raise a hand if you have a question, or if you have a announcement from the local community that you want folks to know about, you do have about 30 seconds to make that announcement as well. So we'll wait for just a second to see if there are any hands raised. And I'll remind you, the biosocial happening this Tuesday coming up at York in Ann Arbor. Hope you can make it. We're not seeing any hands raised today. So next week, I am looking forward to being with you again in the third installment of how do I get a 510K? It'll be less dry than it was this week, because we've set a good foundation to talk about how you actually walk this as a part of your MedTech product company. We'll look forward to next week. Thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.